Hey, Future Brax here. I have to let you know that almost this entire video was filmed on C0 Faruzan, but a problem arose where basically I was forced to have C6. I can't really talk about it because it's NDA, but I need you to just trust me that most of this guide is C0 Faruzan. The only clips that are going to have C6 are going to be the Constellation clips, the Talent clips, and the Hazo Spiral Abyss. Everything else in this video is C0, and the entire video was designed around C0, so free-to-play players do not despair. This one's for you. Hatsune Miku has finally made her way to Genshin Impact as an anemo support, and though she might not be a musical star anymore, she certainly has other things going for her. But with that said, Faruzan has a major issue that you should be aware of before you invest in her. Regardless of all of that, today I'm going to be teaching you everything you need to know about Faruzan, from what makes her good to how to build her. If you enjoy these types of videos, make sure to leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. And with all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Faruzan. To get things started, I'm going to go over her kit at C0, but I will be covering her constellations and their importance later in the video. First off, Faruzan's elemental skill is a hit of anemo damage that sort of acts like Sarah, where you'll gain an enhanced charge shot right after you use it. When you use the charge shot, it creates a suction that pulls enemies in and generates 1 to 2 particles. Now, I'll be completely honest, though the damage of this wouldn't be bad normally, because of how you'll build Faruzan later, it's not going to really add that much. It also just feels extremely bad to play, having to stay on field to shoot an enemy. Oh, and by the way, if you miss your arrow somehow, it just goes away. The charge just disappears. The cooldown is really short on her elemental skill, but that doesn't really fix the fact that if you miss it, it's just gone. So her first ascension passive also helps her skill be slightly less interruptive. Basically, it just makes the time to fully charge a shot decrease by 60%. It also makes it so that her elemental skill can trigger the anemo resistance shred from her burst, but that shred only lasts for 4 seconds, so most of the time it's not going to matter unless you have another anemo character dealing damage off field or an anemo character swapping in dealing a big hit of damage right away. Personally, I found that the shoot an arrow to get energy back and activate the effect mechanic feels pretty clunky, and I'm not really a fan, but I'm sure there's some folks who enjoy it. So as for her burst, this is where most of her kit comes into play. Faruzan sends out AoE anemo damage that travels in a triangular pattern. When it hits an enemy, it buffs your team's anemo damage as well as shreds enemy anemo resistance. Now, the reason this is important is because there's not a lot of anemo resistance shred in the game. Most of it's constellation locked. You have Constellation 4 Jean, Constellation 2 Venti, and you have the Traveler that can also shred anemo resistance for a very short amount of time. It's extremely difficult to get anemo resistance shred in the game, so having access to C0 Faruzan sort of fixes that. Keyword being sort of, because we have a lot to talk about in the constellation section. Now, the buff and debuff for this only lasts for 4 seconds, but ideally Faruzan will be refreshing them when her burst hits. It has a 20-second cooldown, costs a whole 80 energy, and lasts for 12 seconds at C0. The damage from her burst can be pretty solid, but there's a massive issue that Faruzan has that sort of prevents that, where most of the teams you run her in won't generate a lot of energy, and she herself will only generate 1 to 2 particles if you force the charge shot during her skill. When all of your stats are going into energy recharge, that basically makes it so that all of your damage has to be lower. Her second passive makes it so when a character that has her anemo damage buff hits an enemy with anemo damage, they'll get a damage buff based on her base attack. Now, to be honest, this looks a lot better than it is. Faruzan has pretty limited weapon options, and her base attack is pretty low. You'll gain a little bit of damage from this, but it's not really that game-changing. Faruzan's burst can be an insanely powerful utility for teams with anemo damage dealers. Having anemo damage bonus and resistance shred makes her better for anemo characters than Bennett most of the time. However, Faruzan is a character you play in teams with an anemo carry, meaning most of the time you'll play her and Bennett together to buff your carry, so it doesn't really matter if she's stronger or not because you're probably going to play them together. Now, as far as talent priority goes, you'll want to level her burst first for the damage and also the anemo damage bonus increase. After that, you'll level her elemental skill and then normal and charged attacks third. Faruzan is a pretty solid character that's just held back by one major caveat, which is energy. In the build section, I'm going to go over ways that you can circumvent that. So building Faruzan is both very easy and very hard. It's easy in that she doesn't have a dedicated set, and you can sort of just use whatever pieces you need at the time. It's hard in that at Constellation 0, she needs anywhere between 270 and 340% energy recharge to be functional. This is not a joke. She can need over 300% energy recharge. Sometimes with different content, enemies, and team variables, you can run less, but in every team I played her in with 300%, she often had barely enough energy recharge to use her burst every rotation. And if you can't use her burst every rotation, then you might as well just use a different buffing character or off-field damage dealers. I'm not really sure why they decided to lock her energy behind a charge shot, only make it 1 to 2 particles, and also give her an 80 cost burst when other anemo units don't generate much on their own. Venti obviously will make quite a few, but that's a 5-star character that won't be used in every single team and that not everyone has access to. The other thing to think about with her energy recharge is that you may not even end up catching anemo particles with her. You want to use her before your other anemo units so they don't really generate any energy particles to funnel into her, and you may swap off her before she catches her own particles as well. There's a lot of issues with her energy, and unlike someone like Sarah who has Raiden to pair with, Faruzan does not. She's not like other characters where you can kind of sort of get away with less energy recharge. She really has that much of a problem at C0. For artifact sets, I personally run 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate for the energy recharge and damage scaling based off of ER, because when you hit 300%, you're getting a total of 75% damage bonus. That said, there's support sets that could be arguably better for Faruzan in different situations, just depending on your team composition. For example, if you don't play her with Bennett, she can benefit from something like Noblesse Oblige. She won't have 100% uptime on it, but you'll be able to get an extra attack buff when you use her burst. Alternatively, if you play her with off-field damage dealers of swirlable elements, Xiangling, Fischl, Xingqiu, etc., you can give her 4-piece Viridescent Venerer so she acts as your standard anemo support and increases your team's damage output. Keep in mind, Viridescent Venerer does not activate off-field, so you're not going to be constantly proccing the swirl, but you will get the buff when she's on-field and for the next 10 seconds. A lot of the time, you're going to play her in hyper-carry teams where you have Bennett and another supporting unit for your carry and won't need to run Noblesse or Viridescent, but there are definitely cases for using them. Ultimately, if you can't decide, just use the pieces that give you the most energy recharge up to 300% if you're at Constellation 0. This means that her best build for stats is going to be energy recharge on her Sands, anemo damage on her Goblet, and crit rate or damage on her Circlet. You'll also want to try and have a decent amount of crit rate on her for her weapon that we'll talk about right after this. This build is also still true at C6. There are very few cases where you won't want an energy recharge Sands on her, because even at C6 in most team comps, she'll need a lot of energy recharge, still over about 200%. Unfortunately, this is just how she was designed, and we've got to deal with it. As far as her weapon goes, there's some good news. She wants Favonius Warbow, which you get one of for free when you beat the prologue of the game as a quest reward. Faruzan does not want any other weapon unless you have her at C6, and even at C6, I still recommend Favonius. The reason is that Favonius generates particles, and you need those for her. It's that simple. Faruzan just does not generate enough energy to get her burst back on her own. You need a ton of energy recharge, and you need Favonius. At C0, Favonius is going to be a massive help. At C6, you could maybe go for Elegy for the end, but I still don't recommend it just because of how much value Favonius gives her. Keep in mind, you should still be trying to get a decent crit rate and damage on her with your remaining substats, so she should be able to crit consistently. And even if not, since you're going to be using an aimed shot after your skill, you can force a headshot to generate particles with Favonius. Fav is just the perfect weapon for her overall. Sacrificial also doesn't really work because you would need 2 charge shots to generate the bonus particles, which just takes way too much time. I would just use Favonius. Next up, I'll talk about Constellations on her and basically why they help fix her biggest issue. I'm pretty frustrated with how Faruzan plays because it feels like she's one of the few characters that is actually not worth playing at C0. The only other character that I would say does not function in an acceptable way at C0 is Sarah, but even Sarah has ways to fix that. Faruzan does not. So let me show you what I'm talking about. First off, Faruzan C1 lets her fire off 2 arrows after using her skill. It's basically good for her on field, but you won't really use it with her as a support. Her Constellation 2 is helpful because it extends her burst by 6 seconds, which helps with buff uptime and lets her be played with other anemo units. It's a solid constellation, and this is where I would argue Faruzan starts becoming a little bit more playable. Constellation 3 increases her skill by 3, and her C4 gives Faruzan energy back when pressurized collapses trigger, which is essentially just the suction that gets created from her enhanced charge shot. Constellation 5 increases her burst level by 3, and Constellation 6 is an actual game changer for this character. Not only does it give crit damage to anemo damage dealt, but it also makes Faruzan trigger pressurized collapses off field during her burst. Those pressurized collapses will generate energy particles up to once every 3 seconds of her burst, so she's constantly generating energy when she's not even on the field. They also pull in enemies and group them. Essentially, it's just a massive anemo buff, and it makes Faruzan not need an absurd amount of energy recharge to function at a basic level. She'll still need a lot, but it's not unplayable a lot. Faruzan is exactly like Sarah, except the main difference is most anemo characters you play with her don't generate a lot of energy. With Sarah, you have Raiden or Fischl to help her get her burst back consistently, but with Faruzan, you don't have that same energy generation unless you have her C6 to generate more anemo particles. The character unironically feels unplayable to me at C0. The other thing to consider is that her damage gets throttled by you forcing so much energy recharge on her at C0, so it actually can be less worth bringing her in some instances than just bringing another off-field damage dealer or support. The damage difference isn't always enough to offset the need for energy. To put it simply, the character feels awful to play at C0, and at C6 she's an insanely powerful unit, almost like two completely different characters. Most of her power and playability is locked behind that one constellation, and I genuinely have a hard time recommending that you invest in her before C6. That said, it's your account, so you can do whatever you want with it. Honestly, I don't really care what you do with it, I just want to help you build a character. And my apologies for bringing so much negativity to this video, but I did want to be completely transparent. Now, though she feels awful at Constellation 0, she is good for the game and for anemo units. So I want to talk about team compositions and who she's good for, whether or not she works with Xiao, etc. So let's move on to the final section. As far as Faruzan's teams go, you have quite a few options of what you can do with her because she doesn't only work for Wanderer. Obviously, Wanderer is the go-to because she's released with him, and it seems like her buff was made specifically to work with him. However, her buff does work with other anemo units too. As an example, she's actually one of the best supports for Xiao now if you decide to use her. Now, again, the downside is that at Constellation 0, she is a lot harder to run. You're not going to really have an easy time batterying her or Xiao with this team. And so if you don't have C6, you can run into some energy issues, in which case it may be better still to run someone like either C4 Jean or Sucrose, but if you do manage to have her at high constellations, or if you have tons of energy recharge on all your characters, it shouldn't really be as much of an issue. One of the biggest issues with Xiao was that he didn't have a way to shred anemo resistance or defense on his teams. Xiao has a ton of damage percent already. He doesn't really need more anemo damage, he just wants attack and he wants to lower enemy resistances, and Faruzan is basically the single best way to do that for him now. So if you happen to have C6 Faruzan, she can be absolutely game changing for Xiao, and I highly recommend you try it out if you're a Xiao main. And on top of Xiao, you can actually use her with Hazo as well, and Hazo can get some pretty big punches in there. The downside to playing her with Hazo would be that Hazo's personal damage typically isn't that great, and with Faruzan it can be a lot better. His punches hit really hard. I'm mostly talking about his on-field normal and charged attack damage. However, if you're playing him with Bennett and Faruzan, you're gonna have a lot easier time getting higher damage, and because of the nature of how Hazo works, you can actually just play him with someone like Xiao, you can play Fischl, you can play Beto, you can also swap out Bennett for these characters as well, and you're going to see a lot of improvement if you add Faruzan to a Hazo team. In general, I think Faruzan is such a good unit for the game in the fact that she's able to help all of these anemo units that were lacking in some sort of anemo shred achieve much higher numbers than they were able to before. And this is going to be true of future anemo characters as well. Just because of how long Faruzan's buff lasts, you're going to be able to use her with other anemo units in the future that also want to be carries. So I highly recommend trying out Faruzan on your Xiao team, your Hazo team, your Wanderer team, and any other anemo characters that you use to carry. One final last note that I want to tell you guys is that with Faruzan and Wanderer, if you have her at C0, again, like with the Xiao team, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting up energy. One way you can sort of circumvent this is by running someone like Venti, and Venti will help generate extra particles that Wanderer and Faruzan will need. Plus, Faruzan can buff Venti a lot, so if you run attack, anemo damage, crit on Venti, Venti can get pretty high damage output. And alternatively to that, you could also run someone like Jean, but Venti is good because he applies a lot of anemo damage, and Faruzan helps buff that even more. That's basically all there is to say about Faruzan teams. You just play her with anemo characters. And with that being said, let's move on. Despite my negative feelings towards C0 Faruzan, she's absolutely an amazing unit for the game and for anemo. It is a huge bummer that they decided to go this direction by making it so that she's an actual pay-to-win character. However, when you do get access to her later constellations, or if you're lucky enough to have an absurd amount of energy recharge rolls, she can add a lot to your anemo teams. Having a dedicated support for anemo units is amazing, and assuming you're able to get her build all together and play her with your favorite anemo, you're gonna have a great time seeing that damage finally increase past that ceiling that we hit a long time ago. If you managed to get C6, congratulations, you have an amazing unit, and if not, oh well, I hope you're enjoying Faruzan anyways. As usual guys, thank you so much for watching. If you guys have any questions, make sure to leave a comment down below, or just say something nice, I don't know. Y'all are creative, I'm always surprised when I look down in the comments section. Consider subscribing to the channel, I put a lot of work into these videos, and if you would love to see more of them, hit that subscribe button down below, and it'll make sure to show you more of my content as it comes out. I also go live a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone. Make sure to go follow if you want to see live content. Okay, that's it. I'm done. All done. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.